What if I told you that the difference between the men and women who change history and the ones who are forgotten by it has almost nothing to do with talent, almost nothing to do with luck, and almost nothing to do with the family they happen to be born into? What if the real difference was something you could actually build with your own two hands? Starting today, no matter how far behind you feel right now, a blind woman wrote 3,000 hymns. A deaf man composed his greatest music after he could no longer hear a single note of it. A boy too poor to own shoes walked barefoot through the snow just to borrow a single book. And a general, told flatly by his own doctors that he was going to die, looked him in the eye and said, "I won't." By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what all of these people had in common and exactly how you can start building that same quality in yourself, starting today. This is an Iron Will, written in 1901 by Orison Swett Marden, a man who knew something about starting from absolutely nothing. Marden had been orphaned as a small child, shuffled from relative to relative, working brutal hours on other people's farms long before he ever had the chance at a real education. He clawed his way through school and through business, surviving failure after failure, including a hotel he had finally built into a success, only to watch it burn to ground in a single night. And somewhere inside all that struggle, he became obsessed with one question that would define the rest of his life. Why is it that some people, facing exactly the same hardships as everyone around them, manage to rise, while others, given every advantage, simply sink? His answer became one of the great classics of American self-improvement literature, a book that found its way into the hands of presidents, industrialists, factory workers, and struggling students for generations after it was written. Marden wrote it with the help of a collaborator named Abner Bailey, and together they gathered up the stories of history's most stubborn, most determined men and women into a single volume with one simple purpose: to put iron into your spine. So let's get into it. Starting with the very foundation, everything else in this book is built upon: the training of the will itself. Marden opens with a bold claim, borrowed from the philosopher Emerson, that the entire purpose of our existence on this earth is the education of the will, not our raw talent, not the family or the money we start out with. Our will. He reminds us that history's greatest figures, men like Wilberforce, who spent his whole life fighting to end slavery, or Bismarck, who forged an entire nation out of scattered states, could no more be stopped than the sun or the tide could be stopped. They simply decided what they were going to do, and then they went and did it. And here is the sobering part of that claim. Marden insists that most people who fail in life do not fail because they lack education or charm or connections or even opportunity. They fail because they lack dogged determination. They fail because somewhere deep down, they never bother to build a dauntless will. He points out that we live in an age obsessed with athletic training, and he asks a simple question: if we are willing to train our bodies this hard for a race, why aren't we willing to train our willpower with the same discipline? And to illustrate exactly what that kind of training looks like, he tells the story of a young Greek peasant named Soterios Louis, who won the marathon at the recent Olympic Games. There had been no great fanfare about his training. He simply left his work at the plow one day and quietly entered himself as a competitor, hoping to make his country proud in front of the entire watching world. As he left his cottage that morning, his father said something to him that was almost fierce in its simplicity. "Soterai, you must only return a victor." And so he ran. When he crossed the finish line first, the whole overjoyed crowd surged toward him at once. Princes embraced him. Foreign visitors threw flowers and jewelry at his feet. Even the king himself saluted him in military fashion. But Lewis wasn't looking for any of that. His eyes searched frantically through the crowd until they landed on one trembling old man, fighting his way through the celebration. And when his father finally reached him, arms outstretched, the young champion said only this: "You see, Father, I have obeyed." That single sentence, Marden argues, captures the entire spirit of this book. Not glory chased for its own sake, but obedience to a purpose, carried faithfully all the way through to the very end. Of course, athletes train the body, but Marden is far more interested in training the mind, because that is where the real race is actually run. He quotes a professor named Matthews, who insists that only through continued, strenuous effort, repeated day after day, week after week, month after month, can a person acquire the ability to fasten their mind onto one single subject, however knotty or abstract, and shut out absolutely everything else. And he brings in a wonderful observation from the scientist Thomas Huxley, who believed that perhaps the single most valuable result of any education is simply the ability to make yourself do the thing you have to do exactly when it ought to be done, whether you happen to feel like it or not. Here's a trick Marden picked up from the great preacher Henry Ward Beecher. Back when Beecher was asked how on earth he managed to accomplish so much more than other men, Beecher's answer was almost shocking in its simplicity. He said he didn't actually do more work than anyone else. He just did it once. Most people, he explained, do all their work 3 separate times. Once in anticipation, dreading it before they even begin. Once in actuality, when they finally sit down and do the thing. And once again afterward in rumination, replaying it over and over, second-guessing every decision. Beecher trained himself to do his work only once, in actuality alone, and that single habit freed up an enormous reserve of mental energy that most people simply burn away in worry. Marden compares the untrained mind to a leaky dam out in the countryside, where most of the water escapes uselessly around the edges instead of flowing over the wheel and actually turning the machinery. Anyone who allows their attention to wander from one small worry to the next is wasting exactly the same kind of energy. As one poet quoted in the book puts it, genius, that power which dazzles mortal eyes, is often nothing more than perseverance wearing a disguise. So how exactly do you build this kind of focused, concentrated will? Marden's answer is refreshingly simple. The same way you learn to swim, which is by swimming, the same way you learn to run, which is by running. You build willpower through the actual, repeated exercise of willpower in the ordinary business of daily life. Dr. Theodore Coiler is quoted here lamenting how many men simply lack the power of, in his words, holding on until they finally reach the goal. They can manage a sudden dash of effort, he says, but the moment real friction sets in, they lose heart entirely and give up. Marden also brings in the towering image of the giant sequoia trees of California, describing a naturalist's reflection that what struck him most about those trees wasn't their sheer height, but their reserve, the compacted energy of 1,000 summers and winters, poured slowly into their roots over unimaginable stretches of time. In exactly the same way, anyone hoping to rise above the ordinary has to quietly build up their own reservoir of stored knowledge and readiness, so that when the great occasion finally does arrive, they are already equal to it. As one writer put it in the book, if he had only 10 years left to live, he would spend the first 9 simply preparing himself for the 10th. This opening chapter closes on the phrase Marden, considers the single most powerful combination of words in the entire English language. I will. Two short words that carry within them strength, decision, confidence, and the promise of triumph over every discouragement life can throw at you. To fall silent, the book warns, is to be forgotten. To stop advancing, even for a moment, is to be overwhelmed by everyone still moving forward. Life itself, in Marden's view, is simply the unceasing exercise of a will that refuses to quit. From there, Marden moves into what he calls the rulers of destiny, opening the chapter with a poem from Ella Wheeler Wilcox declaring that there is no chance, no fate, and no destiny that can possibly overrule the firm resolve of a truly determined soul. Marden argues that willpower, looked at honestly and without sentiment, is simply energy of character. Wherever that energy exists, there is real life. Wherever it absent, there is only faintness, helplessness, and despondency. He divides all people into three simple categories, borrowed from an old saying making the rounds at the time. There are the wills, the won'ts, and the can'ts. The wills accomplish everything they set their minds to. The won'ts spend their whole lives opposing everything around them. And the can'ts simply fail at everything, convinced from the outset that failure was always their destiny. Marden warns that the shores of history are littered with the wrecks of brilliant men who had every possible advantage except courage and decision. Men who perished in plain sight of the harbor, while far less talented but far more determined competitors sailed safely past them into port. He reminds us that genius without execution is no more genius than a bushel of acorns is a forest of oaks. And then he offers up a wonderful little collection of quotes from history's most decisive men. There's the old playwright's line about the tailor's needle, that once he takes up the humor of the thing, he goes straight through with it, exactly like a needle drawing thread through cloth. Cardinal Richelieu said something almost identical, that once he had taken a resolution, he went straight to his aim, overthrowing everything standing in his way. And the great banker Rothschild put it even more bluntly than either of them. Do, without fail, that which you determined to do. Then Marden turns his attention to the opposite vice, irresolution, which he considers even more dangerous than plain recklessness. He quotes an old writer comparing irresolution to a fever, one that doesn't just shake a single limb, but throws the entire body into a fit all at once. The man who is forever twisting and turning, weighing every tiny detail, listening to every fresh argument that happens to wander by, will never in his life accomplish a single meaningful thing. But the decided man, the positive man, becomes a genuine force in the world. Someone whose worth you can actually measure by what he sets his hand to and finishes. There's a lovely metaphor here about opportunity itself. How it is coy, how it is swift, gone entirely before the slow, the careless, or the indolent can ever manage to seize it. The best men, Marden writes, quoting another thinker, are not the ones who simply waited around for their chance to arrive. They are the ones who besieged the chance, conquered the chance, and eventually made chance itself into their own personal servant. And then comes a passage that I think is really the emotional heart of this whole chapter, a section Marden titles, simply, Do You Believe in Yourself? He insists that a man without self-reliance becomes nothing more than the plaything of chance, the puppet of his own circumstances. He warns that doubt is the greatest enemy any of us will ever face, and that you must never, under any circumstances, allow even the smallest shadow of suspicion to enter your mind that you were somehow not meant to win in life's battle. Every whisper telling you that you might be a failure, that success simply isn't meant for people like you, should be treated exactly the way you would treat a thief breaking into your own house, thrown out immediately without a second thought or a moment's hesitation. The world, Marden tells us, takes every one of us at our own valuation. It believes in the person who believes in themselves. And it is almost no patience left over for the timid soul who is never quite certain, who constantly begs for someone else's opinion instead of trusting their own judgment. There's a wonderful little anecdote tucked into this section about a young man who once told his employer, "Don't give me an easy job. I want to handle the heavy boxes. I want to shoulder the great loads. I would honestly like to lift a mountain and throw it straight into the sea." That, Marden says, is exactly the spirit he is hoping to plant in every single reader of this book. Now we move into what might be the single most thrilling chapter in this entire book, where Marden takes us straight onto the battlefield to examine the force that will encamp and field. He opens by asking what kind of miracle of self-confidence could possibly carry an entire army over the Alps in the dead of winter, or send warships sailing straight past enemy cannon fire, or drive exhausted men to victory against every reasonable expectation of certain defeat. His answer, every single time, is the same: an iron will. He tells the story of Joan of Arc, whose real secret, he argues, was never merely her rare strength of character alone, but her absolute, unshakable confidence in her divine mission. He quotes Admiral Nelson's famous personal rule that whenever he didn't know whether to fight or not, he simply always chose to fight. And he runs through an incredible roll call of history's most stubborn last stands. Horatius holding an entire bridge against 90,000 advancing soldiers. Leonidas single-handedly checking the march of the whole Persian army at Thermopylae. Themistocles shattering an armada off the coast of Greece. Caesar snatching victory from the very jaws of defeat by grabbing up his own spear and shield when his exhausted army began to falter. Each one of these stories, Marden insists, comes down to exactly the same unbendable resolve, dressed up in different uniforms across different centuries. Then he zooms in specifically on Napoleon, sharing a story from his earliest cadet days, when an examiner once asked what he would do if he were besieged in a place with absolutely no food available anywhere. Napoleon answered without a moment's hesitation that if there was anything at all to eat in the enemy's camp, he wouldn't be concerned in the slightest. Marden also tells the extraordinary story of the bridge at Lodi, when Napoleon's grenadiers faced down a wall of Austrian grape shot pouring directly across a narrow bridge. When the very first assault staggered and nearly broke apart entirely, Napoleon himself stepped to the front of the column without a single word of blame toward his frightened men, and personally led the charge across 200 yards of completely open ground, moving so fast that the stunned Austrian gunners simply abandoned their own cannons in a panic rather than face the sheer audacity of it. And there's a marvelous little exchange at the dreaded pass of St. Bernard, when Napoleon asked his engineers whether it was even possible to cross. The hesitant answer came back that perhaps, just perhaps, it was within the limits of possibility. Napoleon's reply was simply, "Forward, then." But Marden is careful to point out that for all of Napoleon's brilliance, it was actually Ulysses Grant, a man with no money, no patrons, and absolutely no fame to his name, who in just 6 years fought more battles and won more victories than Napoleon managed in 20. Lincoln himself said that the great thing about Grant was simply his cool persistence under pressure. There's a wonderful little detail from the Spanish-American War, when the Rough Riders, pinned down under fire on San Juan Hill, began to swear out of sheer terror, and their colonel shouted back through the whistling bullets, "Don't swear, fight." And Theodore Roosevelt himself said of that same charge that he had to run like an absolute cyclone just to stay ahead of his own men and avoid being trampled underfoot. Marden closes his chapter with General Joseph Wheeler, a man who had 16 horses shot dead beneath him over the course of his career, and was wounded 3 separate times himself, yet still rose to the ranks faster than almost any other officer in American history. Living proof, Marden argues, that the same imperial quality will underlies every genuine act of heroism, whether it happens on a smoke-filled battlefield or inside a burning building in the middle of the night. Before we go any further, if this kind of history and this kind of hard-won wisdom is something you're enjoying, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss what's coming next, because the second half of this book is about to get even more personal, showing exactly what an iron can do for your body, your health, and your daily habits, not just your career. That brings us to the 4th chapter, on willpower and its relation to health and disease. Marden opens by observing that men of great decision have almost always also been men of great physical firmness, describing William the Conqueror as a figure whose very presence, his enormous strength and desperate bravery, made him seem like the living embodiment of the sea robbers he had descended from. He tells us that Daniel Webster's physical bearing was so commanding that people used to say no man on earth could really be as impressive as Webster actually looked, and that other men simply yielded their wills to him at first sight, without a word being spoken. But then Marden pivots to something far more useful for the ordinary reader sitting at home: health as the actual foundation for accomplishment. He points out that in an age of such fierce competition, it is health, not raw strength, that allows the brain to sustain the enormous pressure placed upon it day after day. And he gives us Stonewall Jackson as the perfect example of total self-mastery, a man determined from early in life to conquer every single weakness in himself, who refused even to wear an overcoat during the coldest winter months, declaring flatly, "I will not give in to the cold." For an entire year, following his doctor's advice, he lived on nothing but buttermilk and stale bread, and wore a damp shirt directly against his skin, enduring the open ridicule of everyone around him simply because he had decided that discipline mattered more to him than comfort ever could. And when Grant himself was asked how he managed to maintain his own health under such brutal pressure, he answered simply, "I can do nothing without 9 hours of sleep." A small reminder that even the most driven men in history still respected the very real limits their bodies required of them. Then the chapter turns towards something even more remarkable. Story after story of an iron will triumphing directly over physical suffering itself. There's a wonderful account of a professional rope walker who was struck down with terrible back pain just days before he was contracted to wheel a barrow along a tightrope in front of a paying crowd. His doctor forbade him from even getting out of bed, but he refused to listen, dragged himself to the site, trembling with pain the entire way, and wheeled that barrow across the rope exactly as well as he ever had in his life, only to collapse right back into agony the very moment the performance was finally over. He called it, quite simply, his reserve will, a hidden store of strength he could call upon only in the most desperate moments. Marden reminds us that the composer Handel wrote some of his greatest works while struggling against palsy and failing health, that Beethoven composed his most towering music after losing nearly all of his hearing, and that Milton, blind and impoverished and largely forgotten by the world around him, wrote some of his finest poetry in that very same darkness. He tells us about the blind chaplain William Milburn, who studied for the ministry and wrote a careful history of an entire river valley despite never once seeing a single page of his own manuscript, and about the blind and writer Fanny Crosby, who went on to write nearly 3,000 hymns, several of which are still being sung in churches all around the world today. And then there's Darwin, whom Marden describes as living a full 40 years without a single day of real good health, and yet forcing himself, through sheer unbending discipline, to complete work that would have utterly exhausted the strongest constitution imaginable. His own son once said that Darwin actually apologized for his own patience, as though endurance itself were somehow a private weakness rather than the very engine that drove his greatest discoveries. Marden even quotes the novelist Bulwer, who advises readers to simply refuse to be ill, to never speak of their ailments out loud, never to dwell endlessly on their symptoms, and always to hold firmly to belief that they remain complete master of their own body no matter what it might be telling them. He tells us that Napoleon used to personally visit plague hospitals, even when his own frightened physicians refused to go anywhere near them, laying his bare hands directly on the stricken patients, utterly convinced that a man who refused to be afraid could banish the plague through sheer force of will alone. And this chapter closes with the dying words of the writer Douglas Jerrold, who, told bluntly by his doctors that he must surely die, simply looked at them and answered, "And leave a family of helpless children? I won't die." And, remarkably, he didn't, not for many more years. Now we come to what might be the single richest chapter in this entire book, the romance of achievement under difficulties, a long and moving parade of ordinary people who somehow manage to turn poverty itself into the very fuel of their eventual success. Marden opens by insisting that every single person alive is born rich in the truest sense of the word, rich in health, rich in two good hands, rich in the raw mechanism of body and mind that no misfortune can ever fully strip away from us. He tells us about a wealthy Australian rancher named James Tyson, who started life as nothing more than a humble farmhand and ended it worth $25 million, and yet cared almost nothing for the money itself. What actually mattered to him, he said, was the fight. And when asked exactly what fight he meant, he answered that his entire life had been spent fighting the desert itself, putting water where there had never once been water, putting fences where there had never been fences, and roads where there had never before been roads of any kind. Then there's Benjamin Franklin, wheeling his own printing materials to the crowded streets of Philadelphia in a borrowed wheelbarrow because he couldn't yet afford anything better, and later facing down a wealthy business rival, simply by pointing to the small crust of bread that made up his entire dinner that evening, and saying, "Unless you can live cheaper than I can, you cannot possibly starve me out of this business." There's young George Peabody, footsore and genuinely hungry, offering to saw wood at a roadside tavern simply in exchange for one night's lodging and a modest breakfast. There's Gideon Lee, who had no shoes whatsoever as a boy and worked barefoot straight through the snow, holding himself to a personal bargain of 16 full working hours every single day, robbing himself of sleep without complaint whenever he happened to fall behind schedule. And there's a businessman named Rouse, who, while sitting inside a prison cell during a difficult stretch of his life, actually wrote directly on the wall of that cell that by the time he turned 50, he would be worth $500,000, and by 60, a full million. He went on, in the end, to accumulate more than $3 million. Marden then gives us the story of Cyrus Field, who had already retired comfortably with a sizable fortune when he became utterly consumed with the idea of laying a telegraph cable across the entire floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Cable after cable snapped beneath the waves. Funding collapsed more than once. The electrical current itself mysteriously died out in an already completed line, and still he pushed forward year after frustrating year, until a connection between two entire continents finally, triumphantly held. There's a marvelous section here devoted to 4 different New York journalists. Horace Greeley, whose remarkable story Marden says every single schoolchild of his generation already knew by heart. James Brooks, who was so determined to attend college that he carried his own trunk on his back the entire distance to get there, and carried it home again on graduation day because he was still too poor to afford any other kind of transportation. James Gordon Bennett, who at 40 years old, with only $300 total to his name, started an entire newspaper completely alone inside a rented cellar, working simultaneously as his own typesetter, office boy, publisher, and editor all at once. And Thurlow Weed, who tells us in his own words about growing up so desperately poor that he tied old rags around his bare feet just to walk through the snow, and once walked 6 miles round trip simply to borrow a single precious book, reading it late into the night afterward by the flickering light of burning pine knots because his family could never afford real candles. From there, Marden gives us an entire gallery of famous scientists and inventors who rose up out of grinding poverty. The astronomer Kepler, who told fortunes on the side just to pay his own bills. The botanist Linnaeus, who mended his worn-out shoes with folded paper and regularly had to beg meals from generous friends. Isaac Newton, who during the very years of his single greatest scientific discoveries could barely scrape together 2 shillings a week for his own society membership dues. Humphrey Davy, who conducted his earliest experiments using old pans, kettles, and discarded bottles in the cramped attic of the apothecary shop, where he worked as a young apprentice. And George Stephenson, one of 8 children crammed together into a single small room, who built toy engines out of ordinary clay and hemlock sticks as a boy, and grew up to completely revolutionize the steam engine despite never once learning to properly read or write during his own early years. There's a touching little story about a young art student named Astley, so genuinely poor that when his friends all took off their coats together on a particularly hot day, everyone could plainly see he had patched the entire back of his own vest using one of his own hand-painted landscapes. And there's James Sharples, a working blacksmith who rose every single morning at 3 o'clock simply to copy out books he could never afford to buy outright, who deliberately asked for the very heaviest work available at the forge because it took longer to properly heat, and therefore gave him a few more precious spare minutes to study, propping his borrowed book carefully against a warm chimney as he worked through the night. And finally, there's Michelangelo himself, a young boy an old painter once watched quietly sketching pots, brushes, easels, and stools, confidently predicting the child would one day surpass his own teacher, which he absolutely did, becoming the single greatest master of his entire age, even while so desperately poor that he was forced to share one small bed with 3 of his own assistants at once. Marden closes this particular chapter by reminding us that Virgil was the son of a humble porter, that Shakespeare was the son of a simple wool merchant, and that Cromwell was the son of a working brewer. None of these towering figures, he insists, were ever made great by the circumstances of their birth. They were made great, every single one of them, by rising above those circumstances, by first becoming genuinely excellent at whatever humble trade they happened to be given, long before they ever became great at anything else in this world. The 6th chapter is called Staying Power, and it might honestly be the single most important idea contained in this entire book, because Marden insists over and over that persistence, not brilliance, is the real deciding factor behind every meaningful human success. He tells us about the naturalist Audubon, who returned home one day after years of painstaking work out in the forest, only to discover that mice had completely destroyed 200 of his most priceless drawings. He describes the experience as feeling like a burning arrow shot straight through his own brain, collapsing him into a feverish illness for several weeks, before he finally rose back up, picked up his gun and his pencils once again, and calmly walked straight back into the very same forest to simply begin his life's work all over again from scratch. There's an equally painful story here about the historian Carlyle, who once loaned the only existing manuscript of his first volume on the French Revolution to a trusted neighbor, whose careless servant girl mistook the precious pages for ordinary kindling and burned the entire manuscript in her own fireplace. Carlyle, in what must have been almost unbearable disappointment, simply sat back down at his desk and spent many long months painstakingly reproducing from memory what had originally taken him years of careful research to write in the first place. Marden includes a beautiful little anecdote about the great mathematician D'Alembert, who once wrote a brief note to a struggling young student that read, "Go on, sir, go on. The difficulties you meet will resolve themselves as you continue to advance, proceed, and light will dawn and shine with ever-increasing clarity along your path." And there's Balzac, whose own father once bluntly warned him that in the world of literature a man must inevitably be either a king or a beggar, to which the young writer simply answered, "Very well then, I will be a king," before spending 10 genuinely hard years alone in a cramped garret, writing 40 separate failed novels before he ever produced a single successful one. There's Zola, describing years so desperately poor that he sometimes survived on nothing but 3 apples spread across 2 entire days, treasuring a single lit candle as an almost unimaginable luxury, simply so that he could keep studying after the sun went down. There's Samuel Johnson, walking the streets of Oxford with his own bare feet, clearly showing through the worn-out holes in his shoes, and yet still too proud to accept a brand new pair someone had anonymously left outside his door out of pity. And there's Louisa May Alcott, whose own father was told point blank by a magazine editor to simply tell his daughter to give up writing altogether and stick to her modest teaching career instead, because she would never truly succeed as a professional author. Alcott's answer to that harsh rejection was simply, "Tell him I will succeed as a writer, and someday I shall write for that very same magazine," which, in the end, she absolutely did. Marden also shares Charles Sumner's famous formula for lasting success, that 3 things above all else are necessary in this life. First, backbone. Second, backbone. And third, backbone. And he tells a remarkable story of the trial of 7 English bishops, where one stubborn juryman named Arnold held out completely alone against 11 other jurors for an entire freezing, sleepless night rather than agree to a verdict he genuinely believed was unjust, finally yielding to the others only as the first light of morning broke over the courthouse. This chapter closes with words from Henry Ward Beecher, who said that it is defeat itself which turns bone to flint and gristle to muscle, making truly great men invincible, and that you are honestly never so close to real victory as you are in the very moment just after being defeated in a good and worthy cause. And there's a genuinely moving reflection from a former governor of New York, who once said that if he could magically erase 20 separate moments from his own life, he would not erase his own mistakes at all, because those very failures had ultimately become the tonic that shaped him into the man he was proud to be. He would erase his triumphs instead, he said, because it was a hardship, not the easy success, that had actually done the real work of shaping his character over time. The book closes with short final chapter Marden simply calls a degree of O.O., built around a memorable story about the traveling evangelist Dwight Moody, who, upon first visiting Ireland, was introduced by a friend to a local merchant who immediately asked whether Moody happened to be an O.O., meaning out and out, entirely and completely devoted, in this particular case to his own religious faith. Marden uses this small, almost throwaway story as his final closing thought for the entire book, arguing that this same total, undivided decisiveness which wins battles, builds fortunes, and produces truly great art is ultimately meant to serve something far larger than personal success alone. A well-trained will, he argues in these final pages, is nothing more or less than a tool, and like every tool ever made, it can be turned either toward purely selfish ends or toward the genuine uplifting of other people. And the real difference between those two paths is precisely the difference between a will that merely conquers for its own sake and a will that actually does lasting good in the wider world around it. So here in the end is the entire message of an iron will, boiled all the way down to its simplest essence. Talent is common. Money is common. Even opportunity itself, if you actually go looking for it, is far more common than most people ever want to admit. What is genuinely rare, what Marden found again and again in every single story he gathered together across this book, whether it was a barefoot boy borrowing a book in the falling snow, a deaf composer writing music he could never once hear for himself, or a young runner simply obey his father's final instruction before a race, is nothing more than the quiet decision to keep going, exactly when everything inside you desperately wants to stop. That decision is available to you right now, today, in whatever situation you personally happen to find yourself in. You don't need anyone's permission to start building it. You simply need to begin exercising it, one small decision at a time, the very same way you would train any other muscle in your body, until one day, almost without realizing it, you look back and discover you have quietly become exactly the kind of person history remembers long after they're gone. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while I was putting it together, do one more small thing before you go. Hit that subscribe button so that the next one finds you right when you need it the most. Until then, go build your iron will.